No, go on.
So, welcome. This is the third lecture of a series of lectures that the International Health and Political Economy of Health Research Group organized for the first time this year. For the third lecture, we invited Dr. Miran Epstein. Miran, thank you very much for being with us. Miran is, although he doesn't need a lot of introduction, Miran is a medical doctor. He's a reader and associate professor here at Queen University, teaching medical ethics. And we asked him to give a lecture on Marxism and medical ethics, a lecture that we are looking forward to. Thank you very much for being here with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Really, thank you, Elias. Thank you, Jonathan, for your kind invitation. It's really an honor and pleasure being here and talking about this particular topic, Marxism, or rather Marx, on medical ethics, particularly because there's virtually nothing about it out there. And of course, also, but that's the point I will try to sell to you today, and this is that Marx has got a lot to say about medical ethics and to those who are interested in medical ethics. So I will try first to deal with the question, why Marx? Why Marx? By raising a problem which some of my students here may recognize from our lectures, and this is the fact that our medicine, I'm talking not just about the medical profession, I'm talking about the medical system in general, what is generally called the healthcare system, and is often not really about, or not necessarily about health, which appears as if it is a paradox. Medicine, on the one hand, has an ostensibly patient-centered ethic. However, it abuses the patient, and I emphasize here, even and mostly when it follows this ethic to the letter. I think it's a very important point to make. It's not when medicine violates the ethic that it harms the patient. Of course it harms the patient when it violates the ethic, okay? But this is marginal compared to the harm that it does to the patient when it does everything by the book. I want you to pay attention to one quote here from the General Medical Council, Good Medical Practice, which is in essence the code of ethics in this country, which embodies, the quote itself embodies the kind of paradox I'm talking about. All doctors must make the care of their patients their first concern. In other words, the patient comes first. However, first or not first, the treatment options that can be offered to patients may be affected by limits of resources. So maybe there's something else that comes first and not the patient. This is just one instance. I'm talking about a range of phenomena in medical practice, including the declining access to medical care, the deteriorating quality of care, the distorted agenda of clinical medicine, the distorted agenda of medical research, and the agenda of development of new medical technologies and medicines, the increasing inequalities in health, and so on and so forth. All these things happen even and mostly when everything is done according to the ethic. There is very little in the literature, if at all, about this paradox. Very little. It doesn't exist, really. It doesn't exist in the form of a paradox. And therefore, it's also difficult to come across explanations for the paradox. But nevertheless, with a little bit of tweak here and there, one can come up with two explanations which I can refer to easily as the mainstream explanations. One of them would say this appears like a paradox, it's an ostensible paradox, which results from the false assumption of me, for example, notably, that the political will, the public does not want to put medicine first. The public doesn't want to put medicine first, and the medical will, the public wants medicine to put the patient first, are somehow related to one another, or that they are mutually exclusive. In other words, there is no paradox here. It's okay, it's conceivable that we as a society decide that medicine does not come first, but within medicine we decide that the patient comes first. So there is no paradox. Another explanation, which is quite common among some of my colleagues, is that the ostensible paradox results from a gap between the promises of the ethic and its ability to deliver on them. Medicine is therefore insufficiently patient-centered because its ethic, contrary to its appearance, is insufficiently patient-centered. The solution for the paradox is obvious. In this case, just change the ethic, make the ethic a little bit better, and the paradox will disappear. Okay, there is also a third explanation, the kind of explanation which I cannot unfortunately develop in this short span of time that we have here, but my students can attest to the fact that I try at least to do that over one semester, at least if not a whole 5-year curriculum. And this is that the ethic of medicine, our medical ethics, is ostensibly patient-centered, when in fact it is a capitalist ethic, namely an ethic of, by, and for a capitalist medicine, a medicine that does not put the patient first. A capitalist medicine cannot have a patient-centered ethic, but it is bound to have an ethic that appears as if it were patient-centered. This is a conclusion that follows a so-called Marxist, I will say something about whether it should be called even Marxist or perhaps something else, but it follows a Marxist approach to the study of medical ethics. So I would like to focus on this approach and try to convince you very briefly and unfortunately superficially that it has lots of merit. Before I do that, I want you to pay attention to two quotes which reflect nothing but acute observations, sociological observations by Karl Marx. One from the Communist Manifesto, the other one, I believe, is the second one is from Capital Volume 1. Here, Marx says, Marx together with Engels in this case, that the bourgeoisie, i.e. capitalism, has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, please note, in the first place, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science, into its paid wage laborers. And then, this piece, by the way, comes in the origin before, but it makes sense now to put it just after here. It has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms, it has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. Okay, here what we see is a kind of a premonition by Marx about the bioethical transformation, the disappearance or the decline of the fiduciary, the old traditional so-called paternalistic fiduciary model, and the rise of the contractual model, which, whether it has money involved or it doesn't have any money involved, at least follows the logic of the market. The other point, which is related here, another acute observation by Marx, is from a famous, very famous footnote from the first chapter of Capital, when Marx just kind of gives us his observation that in capitalist societies, the economic legal fiction, fictio juris, prevails, that everyone as a buyer possesses an encyclopedic knowledge of commodities. This is the essence of a critique of informed consent as a legal fiction that rests, among other things, also on the fiction of informedness. And such a fiction obviously builds on the idea that we, all of us, go back to Adam Smith. He will tell you that all buyers, all members of the market, they have all the knowledge they need. They are really, really essentially autonomous. But I'm not really interested, nor do we have time, to focus on these small, however important observations. What I would like, here is another one, so just let's focus on it for a second. What I would like to do really is focus on method and premises and method of the Marxist or Marx's thought, which have such value, I hope to convince you, for thinking, reflecting on medical ethics. Here's another point from an earlier study by Marx called Grundrisse, something between his early writings and Capital, where Marx deals with the concept of productivity. What does it mean to be productive in a capitalist society as opposed to productive in other societies or in other social niches? So here he says, for the consistent economists, the workers in, for example, luxury shops are productive, although the characters who consume such objects are expressly castigated as unproductive wastrels. The fact is that these workers indeed are productive as far as they increase the capital, i.e. the profit of their master, and unproductive as to the material result of their labor. In fact, of course, this productive worker cares as much about the crappy shit he has to make as does the capitalist himself who employs him and who also couldn't give a damn for the junk. But looked at more precisely, it turns out, in fact, that the true definition of a productive worker consists in this: a person who needs and demands exactly as much as, and no more than, is required to enable him to gain the greatest possible benefit for his capitalist. The point I'm alluding to here is, for example, the criterion, the major criterion of justice in allocation of so-called scarce resources in medicine, which is the quality-adjusted life years, used to be called the disability-adjusted life years, which is not about life expectancy and is not about quality of life. It's about effectiveness and about outcome, which ultimately can be reduced to this essence of productivity, to investment in those patients who will be able to ultimately resume work and contribute to GDP, the tax system, and most importantly, to the generation of profit. But again, I'm interested here, and I also believe that you should be interested in the basic premises and the method which Marx can offer us. So first of all, this is a very vague idea which many people may accept regardless of whether they accept other Marxist conclusions. This is not really a conclusion, but a metaphysical premise. It's a metaphysical premise. Take it or leave it. It's not something to argue. Some people think it's exactly the opposite. Okay, it's fine. Okay, then maybe this lecture should not be for you. But what Marx believes, it's a belief. It's his belief. It's his basic the basic premise on which he is working, is that people develop while developing their material production and their material intercourse, they alter along with this their real existence, they also alter their thinking and the products of their thinking. Life is not determined by consciousness, but consciousness is determined by life. And this means, ultimately, when it comes to ethic, that every ethic is an ideological form, and I emphasize here, form, of some material content. So it kind of develops with some material, with and from some material content. Every medical ethic is therefore an ideological form of some concrete medicine which comprises certain players, means, interests, and relations. When I say, by the way, ideological, I need to make it clear. I'm not making any value judgment. I'm saying just that we are talking about a set of ideas. Ideology in the sense of a set of social ideas, obviously. Okay? So here's everything you wanted to know about form-content relations, but were afraid to ask. So I have constructed for you a, since we are dealing with form and content, the ethic being a form of something, of some kind of medicine, I constructed for you, or put it down in writing, a list of everything I could think of when it comes to form-content relations. So first of all, by the way, some of the stuff may be a little bit too abstract and too complicated. If there are any questions, please be my guest, ask them later on or even now. The form is how the object appears to us. This is the form. Everything that is amenable to our senses, okay? Thus it is concrete and hence overt, obvious. The content, on the other hand, is the general essence of the object. And therefore it is abstract and hence covert. We don't see general things, we see concrete things. We can, for example, here underneath these general points, I've given you just the concrete parallel about the ethic. We can readily identify our medical ethic. We can read the rules of the GMC, for example, yes, but we cannot readily identify the medical content to which these rules correspond, okay, because it is the general essence that ultimately gives rise to this particular form. Number two, form and content are relative terms. So I don't want you to think in kind of absolute ways that form is, whatever is form, medical ethics is just a form. No, medical ethics at the same time is also a content that has its forms. So, for example, the form of medical ethics in this country is the GMC, okay? But the form in Holland, for example, of medical ethics is a little bit different, okay? It's a different form. So, form and content are relative, as is or are the terms concrete and abstract. They are relative too. What is concrete is simply what we observe. It is an expression of something that is abstract. Yes, but once we observe the abstract thing, it becomes a form in itself and therefore concrete. So, for example, although we cannot readily identify the content underlying the ethical form, we may possibly identify it as a form of something else. I want to be more specific. I am arguing, will ultimately conclude, not now, yes, but I have already concluded that the content underlying the ethical form is a capitalist medicine, okay? Now, it is not obvious from the form that the content is a capitalist medicine, but it is possible that we are aware of a capitalist medicine as a form of something else, okay? Not as something that gives rise necessarily to medical ethics. I hope this point is clear. Point number three, form and content do not exist independently of one another. Together, they constitute the concrete object. So, for example, there is no such thing as medical ethics, you know, in itself. It's like a grin without a cat, to quote Lewis Carroll, okay? But it is the ethic of a certain medicine. And together, this medicine is this particular concrete ethical medicine. So the object is the ethical medicine. Our medical ethic and the particular medicine whose expression it is constitute jointly our concrete ethical medicine. Okay? I know it's very abstract, but it will gradually become more accessible to understanding, I hope. Point number 4, the content may have more than one form at any point in time. So I'm not suggesting at all that medicine has only an ethical form. It has other forms as well. So medical ethics is the primary ideological form of our medicine, but our medicine has other ideological forms and also material forms. So it's not the only form. Number 5, similar contents may have different forms, while different contents may have a similar form. So, for example, similar kinds of medicine may have different ethics, while different kinds of medicine may have a similar ethic. So the fact that we have, or what I argue is ultimately a conclusion, that informed consent in capitalist medicine does not mean that in, say, socialist medicine, informed consent will not be an ethic. Okay? So it's not, the form and the content do not necessarily coincide. Form and content do not necessarily imply one another. Point number 6, the form and the content develop together. This is an important point which is, I have discussed it with one of the students here in this room yesterday. The form and the content develop not one after the other. Okay? They develop together. The thing and how it is expressed, they develop together. Not one in a vulgar, the kind of vulgar conception that we have of causation is that A comes before B, and therefore B is, the kind of the effect of A, and there is kind of a distance between B and A. No, B is the expression of A, and they develop like, I could give, the relationship between the present and the past as a good example. The present is the expression of the past. The future is the expression of the present. Okay? The present is an expression of the past. It develops with the past. As the past develops, the present develops with it. So, while our medicine develops along with its ethic, a change in our medicine does not necessarily entail a change in the ethic. The form will appear, i.e. the ethic will appear, transform in some way, or even disappear altogether, only if changes in the content so dictate. An expression of something, yes, does not follow necessarily what happens. It changes, the expression changes only if changes in the thing it expresses so dictate. Okay. The form, point number 7, will stick to the changing content only as long as it suits it. The content changes, the form sticks to it until it doesn't. Some ethical elements, for example, of the Hippocratic medicine, such as the duty of medical confidentiality, have survived into our medicine. So yes, the old form sticks, because it still suits the content, despite the fact that the content has changed. Number 8, up to a certain point, the form may lag behind the changing content. It follows from the previous points, even if it no longer suits it as well as it did. But beyond that critical point, the content is bound to assume another form instead. So for example, resistance in medicine to the old paternalistic ethic of best interest and to the fiduciary model of doctor-patient relationship appeared long before medicine got rid of this kind of old ethic. So, but it was still appropriate and corresponding to the old medicine in terms of it suited it well enough, even if it did not suit it perfectly. Certain Hippocratic rules, for example, had come in conflict with our medicine sometime before it replaced them with new rules. It adhered to them because they met some old interests, and only insofar as these interests prevailed over the new interests it acquired. Point number 9. The content excludes certain forms and vice versa. So, for example, a capitalist medicine, and I'm not suggesting here at this very moment that this is the kind of medicine that we have, may choose among many different ethics, but it can have no socialist ethic, nor can any capitalist ethic correspond to, say, Stone Age medicine. So there must be some relationship between the form and the content. They must suit one another, although they don't. The form may pertain to different contents, and the content may embrace or give rise to different forms. There is a famous kind of saying among musicians when they kind of criticize one another for having done something wrong. There are 1,000 ways of playing piano. Forte is not one of them. Okay, so yes, capitalist medicine may have this ethic, that or that ethic, or another ethic, but it cannot have a socialist ethic. I can put it in more kind of simple form. A medicine that does not care at all about the patient can have different ethics, but it cannot have a patient-centered ethic. Okay? It cannot have such an ethic. Point number 10. The form may or may not coincide with its content. You surely remember point number 5 when we spoke about... you don't. Okay, so here's point number 5. Similar contents may have different forms may have similar contents, and therefore the form may or may not coincide with the content. Can ethics ever coincide with its content? I will argue very soon that the answer is no. Some forms do coincide, some forms don't coincide. Some forms sometimes coincide, and in other times they don't coincide. Ethics never coincide with their content. I will explain that shortly. Point number 11. The form is irreducible to the content. You cannot reduce the form. This kind of reductionist materialism or vulgar materialism or scientific reductionism, as it called, it would be great if we could reduce the form to the content. Unfortunately, I'm not making here a value judgment. I'm saying technically it doesn't work. You cannot reduce the form to the content. You cannot reduce a triangle to a pizza slice. Okay? However, the triangle is a historical expression of the development under the certain circumstances of the pizza slice. So that the content determines and explains the form, and it's not the other way around. It is our kind of medicine that explains the kind of ethic that we have, and not the other way around. Point number 12. The content determines not only the form, but also the way it develops. So, for example, medicine determines its ethic in a way that differs from how the environment, for example, determines its biological or physical forms. Okay, so it's a different way in each and every case. Point number 13. The form is in itself meaningless. I said that before, and I'm urging my students to always understand that when I ask them, are you in favor of legalizing euthanasia or assisted suicide? Here's one of my students. The answer is? Who is asking? Bravo. Yes, they learned something. Yes, the answer is no, yes or no. The answer is, what kind of medicine? Let me understand the context, i.e. the content underlying the form before I make a judgment about the ethic. So the form is in itself meaningless. It obtains its concrete meaning only vis-a-vis the content to which it corresponds. The meaning, for example, of our medical ethics, namely its concrete social role, what it does, what it actually does, depends on and can only be deciphered in the light of the concrete medicine whose expression it is. Point number 14. There are just few further points. So take it easy. Take it easy. Everything will become, I will simplify everything in a moment. Point number 14. The form must be judged by its content and not the other way around, because it's just a symptom. It's just an expression of the content. While all ethics glitter, I will explain why all ethics glitter shortly. Yes, only some of their contents are actually gold. Thus, contrary to intuition and common practice, social relations must not be judged by their ethic. It's exactly the other way around. The ethic must be judged by the relations to which it corresponds and which it reinforces. I will show that later on again. Point number 15. Criticizing the form can make sense only if one criticizes the content. So there is no point in, for example, criticizing our medical ethic or a particular rule in question without also criticizing the medicine that gave rise to it. After all, the former, the ethic, is just an expression of a symptom of the latter. Point number 16, and it's just the penultimate point before the point number 17, the last one, says a change of the form could only make a profound difference against a profound change of the content. So regardless of how radical a change in a medical ethic may seem, it can only be as radical as the change in medicine. This is my response to those who say, just change the ethic and everything will be fine. I'm saying to them, well, the change in the ethic can be no more radical than the change in the practice. So if there is no change in the practice, the change in the ethic will not make any difference, any meaningful difference at all. And the last point is that points number 5 and 10, is it the last point? Yes, it is. That points 5 and 10, you remember that points that together say that the ethic may not, or the form may not coincide with the content. That's an important point. It may not. If it coincided with the content, then we would have had no such a discussion of the kind we're having here. Okay, the content would be obvious. Point number 5 and 10 create a problem for us because the ethic or the form does not necessarily coincide with the content, but fortunately, the form holds the key to the content. The form, the expression of the thing, holds the key for us to arrive to decipher the content itself. Because it is an expression of some content, it is likely to carry its fingerprints. While our medical ethics, for example, implies no particular medicine, it carries the fingerprints of some particular medicine. Unfortunately, we do not have time to analyze the ethic, yes, and show you these fingerprints. Perhaps I can later on give an example or two, but this is really the key to starting to understand and decipher the kind of medicine whose expression is the ethic. This is a quote, again, by Marx, who says everything about science. Science is exactly the aim of science is to figure out the content underlying the form, the content, and it would have been superfluous if the form and the content were to coincide, or to always coincide, which they don't. Okay? So here's the method. The method is, in short, analytic synthetic. In other words, reconstructive constructive, I will explain. And for ideas, including ethics, it must be sociological historical. So, what do I say? I'm saying the following, and I will support. I mean, we'll give Marx as the first person to come up with this method and to explicate this method, not to come up with a method. The method had existed before Marx. Marx did not invent the method, but he put it in writing, to the best of my knowledge, for the first time. What does it mean, an analytic synthetic method? It means that we start with a form, with the ethic, okay? We analyze the ethic. The analysis is sociological. We ask ourselves what kind of world this form, or medicine, this form presupposes, not implies. It doesn't imply any particular form, but what kind of medicine it presupposes. Let's assume that we reach some kind of a tentative conclusion. It's a suspect content, just a suspect content, because it's what the ethic presupposes. It's not something that it implies. Now, however, when we find the actual parallel of this suspect content in reality, in medical reality, we can construct a tentative theory of the ethic. So if the ethic presupposes this kind of medicine, then our theory, tentative theory, should be that the ethic is a historical expression of such kind of medicine, but it's just a theory. It's totally speculative. And this puts the onus on us to substantiate it. For this we need the second, the synthetic or constructive stage. And the constructive or synthetic stage, in this case, in the case of ethics, is historical. We need to be able to show that in a causal manner, a connection between the ethic and this particular medicine. In other words, we need to construct the ethic from this particular suspect content. Once we do that, we have not verified, not confirmed, but corroborated, supported, just simply kind of supported the theory. We can always have debates. Did I do the analysis correct? Did I provide kind of accurate evidence for the development of the ethic from did I furnish a convincing story or not? These debates are serious debates and they should take place, no doubt. But this is the only way to ultimately make a reasonable, rational connection between, or to link the content to a particular form. What is it, if not the universal scientific method? It's not Marx's method. He didn't invent it. This is exactly what Darwin did. This is exactly what later on Einstein did, what earlier on Copernicus did. They started with the form. They asked themselves what kind of a content it presupposes. They found a parallel to this suspect content in reality. They generated a scientific theory, and they showed either in the laboratory or in reality, a big laboratory, yes, that the form can be constructed from this suspect content. Later on, with new information, of course, the theory might collapse and need to be changed, but that's a totally different matter. This is how Marx presents the scientific theory, the scientific method. Of course, the method of presentation, this is the second. The presentation is here, the history of the thing. This is the second phase, second stage of the method. Of course, the method of presentation must differ in form from that of the inquiry. The inquiry is the analytic stage. The latter, the inquiry, which is the first stage, has to appropriate the material in detail, to analyze its different forms of development, and to track down the inner connection. So this is the first analytical stage. Only after this work has been done can the real movement be appropriately presented. If this is done successfully, if the life of the subject matter is now reflected back in the ideas, then it may appear as if we have before us an a priori construction. And this is ultimately the historical narrative. Here, we started here, and this happened, and that happened, and this happened, and this is the expression of the whole thing. It appears as if it is an a priori construct, when in fact it is a product of analysis, first of all. This is exactly the kind of method that Marx applies to the study of economic categories and also other categories. He started, by the way, with the category of God when he was younger, yes? But in Capital, he applies this scientific method to the study of economic categories, such as the category of money, the category of commodity, etc., etc. As ideas, economic categories are ultimately ideas. In other words, what Marx does, and this is really the new thing which he offers, is the application of the universal scientific method to the study of ideas, as opposed to the study of nature. Well, ideas are natural too. Yes, the study of physical nature, of biological nature, and other areas in reality. Okay? Here, Marx emphasizes the importance of the second stage, the constructive stage, the stage where we build, where we construct the form from the suspect content, the stage where we corroborate the tentative, speculative theory which we generated in the first stage. It is in reality, he says, much easier to discover by analysis, the first stage, the kernel of the mystic creations of religion, than to do the opposite, to develop from the actual given relations of life the forms in which these have been aposteosized. The latter method is the only materialist and therefore the only scientific method. This is how he calls it. So what does he say here? He says it's very difficult, to analyze the concept of God. God is almighty, and see, what does God presuppose? God presupposes a master, an almighty master, a man, okay, etc., etc. This is easy to do, yeah? But to prove it, or to, sorry, not to prove, that's too strong, but to substantiate the theory that man created God rather than God created man, okay, one needs to show now from reality how the concept of man evolved. This is a big challenge because it requires hard evidence, historical evidence. This is a big challenge. But without it, the theory remains speculative. Okay? Marx speaks about ethics. He says the word morality. He means, when he says morality, he means ethic. He doesn't really address issues about what is good or what is bad. He doesn't deal with the philosophical question, okay? But he addresses the question of ethics, justice, ethics, morality, and so on, okay? Not what is really good or bad, what our society regards as good or bad. Very rarely, okay? In Capital Volume 3, he says the following, which is, for him, it's obvious. To him, it is obvious to say that, but it's not obvious at all, if you think about it. He says, the justice of the transactions between the agents of production rests on the fact that these transactions arise as natural consequences from the conditions of production. The juristic, i.e., ethical forms, yes, in which these economic transactions appear as the will of the parties concerned. They are expressions of the collective will, as expressions of their common will, and as contracts that may be enforced by the law against some individual party, cannot determine their content. They don't determine capitalism, the forms, the juristic forms, since they are only forms. They merely express this content. So the content is just, please note, the content is just, i.e. ethical, whenever it corresponds and is adequate to the mode of production, and is unjust whenever it contradicts that mode. So, for example, slavery on the basis of capitalist production is unjust, and likewise fraud in the quality of commodities. Okay? in capitalism, if you kind of steal, infringe copyrights, etc., etc., this is what is necessarily considered as injustice. Okay, so Marx does not produce any explanation to this kind of correspondence between the ethic and or between the kind of justice he talks about and the capitalist society. He doesn't produce any general theory. He doesn't furnish explicitly any general theory of ethics. However, I've done it. Okay? I've done it for you. Yes, which I will present here in a nutshell, very, very briefly. By the way, how are we with time?
We have time.
Yeah, we
What
have
time
time,
is it?
so it's 10 to 6. Relax.
Okay,
We have
so
time.
I won't take I won't take too much. I will do it very, very kind of briefly. Okay, so this is not Marx's work. It's the work of someone who continues the work of Marx. What is the general content and underlying ethics? The kind of universal content, abstract content that is underlying any ethic. The answer to this question is important because it should offer us or tell us before we start our analysis what it is in general in the abstract that we are looking for, okay, as fingerprints. So here's what I suggest. An ethic appears under the following conditions. Okay, there are 3 necessary and sufficient conditions, given sufficient time, obviously, for an ethic to appear. First of all, there must be conflicts of interest or conflicts, and therefore also relations of power. If there are no conflicts and no relations of power, there's nothing to regulate, and therefore there's no need for justice. In Garden of Eden, where everything is totally harmonious, there is no ethic. So it's not an unethical, it's a non-ethical environment, and non-ethical because it is totally harmonious. Okay? So the first condition for the emergence of an ethic is conflicts and relations of power. The second condition is that the parties, let's talk about 2 parties because it's just to simplify things, that the parties who are in conflict with one another, yes, must somehow depend on one another and therefore have some common ground. Now, I'm not saying that the dependency is because they love one another, okay? They may, but not necessarily. They must depend on one another. Something like doctors depend on patients because if there are no patients, there's no livelihood, okay? And patients depend on doctors because if there are no doctors, who will treat them? Okay, so there is some kind of a dependency here. The same is true for masters and slaves. They depend on one another. The master depends on the slave in various ways. By the way, also just to live, if the slave, behaves badly, he or she might put the life of the master at risk. So they depend on one another, both parties, okay? And in capitalism, relationship between employer and employee, they again depend on one another. I need this job, okay, and I need you to work for me. There is interdependence here, so there is also some common ground. And the third condition, necessary condition, and all with the previous 2, also sufficient condition for the emergence of an ethic, is that the power gap between the parties must be narrow, but not too narrow. Why? If it's wide, then the stronger, the more powerful party will simply crush the weaker one with plain violence. No talk. It's like parents and little children. Okay, you go there, you go to your room. Okay, there is no talk, no rules, no ethic, no nothing. It's just force, blatant force, and that's it. Okay. What will happen if the power gap is too narrow? If the power gap is too narrow, then both parties will do nothing but fight one another. Okay? However, if the power gap is narrow but not too narrow, and if there are conflicts, but also there is some common ground and interdependency, okay, then the parties will be forced to negotiate some kind of a compromise. Now, the compromise will, first of all, most basically, have material aspects in the form of relations. For example, the compromise that doctors and patients negotiated in the recent past was that of the doctors are the trustees, the patient the beneficiaries. These are relations, they are material. I mean, I'm here and you're here, you will listen to me and I will do whatever is good for you. I'm entrusted with deciding what is good for you and do it. Okay? Now we have a different kind of compromise, and the compromise puts us, doctors and patients, vis-a-vis one another as symmetrical parties. I don't owe you anything, on the contrary, and you don't owe me anything. I owe myself everything, and you owe yourself. We are kind of confronting one another as two individuals, symmetrical individuals who enter a contract on the basis of their common will. And that's it. Okay? So the compromise is first of all material. This is the point I'm trying to make. But as anything else that people do, which has a material aspect, they reflect it or express it to themselves in the form of a certain corresponding psychology with a corresponding ideology, ideas. Okay? The regulatory, it's not the only expression, but the regulatory expression, what to do and what not to do, of a compromise is nothing but an ethic. That's it. Here you have a theory of ethic. But unfortunately, I don't have easy access because of the camera to the board here. But I would have drawn here kind of a general I would have made here a general drawing expressing the problem which now arises from the emergence of the ethic. First of all, the ethic, since it is an expression of compromise, it naturally expresses what the parties have agreed upon. Okay, this is the point about the ethic. Okay, now what did they agree upon? They agreed upon the things that not the things, but certain things that ultimately, in one way or another, provided each one of them with some benefit. This is exactly the nature of compromise. That, I make concessions, you make concessions, but we agree about something that gives us certain benefit. Okay? And therefore, I can already tell you that all ethics, because they reflect nothing but the consensual, yes, give us the impression that the reality which they express is totally harmonious. When it is not, when it is never harmonious, it is always disharmonious. Because it is disharmonious, it gives rise to a seemingly harmonious expression that focus only on what they have agreed upon. The relations of power are excluded from both the compromise as well as its ethical expression. Excluded. The ethic doesn't talk about. The ethic doesn't say, and also the dominance of capital in medicine is a good thing, and that's it. No. We don't agree about these things, and therefore they are excluded from the ethic. Okay? The thing is that since the ethic focuses on nothing but what the parties have agreed upon, it becomes a form that does not coincide with the content and does not imply the content. So, for example, the same ethic, and this is one of the points I've mentioned about form-content relationship, the same ethic can be an expression in principle of a completely different compromise. So if here is a game, the big game, with conflicts and so on, yeah, this is the ethic, here, okay? But the ethic could pertain also to a different game. There is, okay, the ethic is here, or to a third game, and so on and so forth. I will not do the analytic synthetic work here, but I do it when I teach my students, ultimately arriving in the conclusion that our medical ethics is an expression of a capitalist medicine. There is nothing wrong with the ethic in itself. The ethic is in itself meaningless, as I said, yes, but it becomes meaningful only when we understand that it is in essence an expression of a medicine that does not put the patient first. So here is my conclusions, and with them I will finish. The first conclusion is caution ethics. When people tell you it has been approved by a research ethics committee, grab for your gun, right? Grab for your gun. Okay, don't say, okay, approved by an ethics committee, fine, okay. Or when people tell you, God said, God said, no. Beware, because the ethic may correspond, conceal, it doesn't coincide, may correspond, conceal, reinforce, and perpetuate relations that are not humanist, but rather misanthropic, okay? So the first conclusion is caution ethic. The second conclusion, avoid the ethical corrupt distinction. Don't think, it's either ethical or it's corrupt. Yeah, this is the kind of the mainstream way of thinking about medicine. Pharmaceutical corruption, a lot is talked about. Yeah, it's important to focus on pharmaceutical corruption, but it is a lot more important to focus on the immoral stuff that is done by the pharmaceuticals totally in accord with the ethic. Okay? Now, together with this point, I'm saying make your critique imminent. What is an imminent critique? An imminent critique is critique of the thing at its best. Okay? As opposed to when it's not at its best. Okay? i.e. corrupt. Don't criticize slavery for beating slaves. Don't criticize slavery for beating slaves. Criticize slavery for exploiting slaves. Okay? Don't criticize capitalism for not paying the worker. It happens sometimes, they employ you and then they don't pay. You work and then they don't pay. This is at its best, when they pay. Okay? When they pay. And here, I must refer you to another quote from Karl Marx, which is one of the most famous. It's from Capital, from chapter 6, yes, where he talks about the sphere of exchange as an Eden of rights. Okay, I will not belabor you with just reading this long passage, but he says, let us presume, even if it's not the case, let us presume that the parties are really symmetrical, that they stand vis-a-vis one another as kind of free agents, and so on. But he says, let us also leave this sphere, yes, and when we leave this sphere, we realize that the exploitation takes place not in the sphere of transaction. It takes place in the sphere of production. Okay? This is, I believe, an important point. Marx does not criticize capitalism for overpricing, okay? For overpricing commodities. He criticizes it when it says when all commodities are exchanged for value per value, equivalent value, yes? The criticism is there, okay? I think we should do it when we should do the same when we criticize our medicine. It's not when it's corrupt that we should focus on its problems, but rather when it is done perfectly, ethically. The third point is that however sublime our medical ethic may seem, it cannot be the remedy for our ailing medicine, as it is nothing but a pathological symptom thereof. Moreover, being sick, our medicine cannot have a healthy ethic, and no ethic, old or new, could by itself heal it. If you wish to have a humanist medical ethic, get yourself a humanist medicine. And this is what Marx says. The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. It's not really a critical work for us to come up with a different ethic, with another ethic, something that seems more kind of patient-centered. We need a different kind of medicine, and this is a different kind of work. Thank you very much.
I would say thank you very much for the talk. And I don't know if you would like to make, I would like to make one question, so I will start. Actually, I have two questions. The first one is why you never mention historical materialism or scientific materialism. You talk the whole time about this, but you don't name it. I found just curious. And the second thing is, when the point is to change it, it has been, in a way, misinterpreted or rightly interpreted, that the whole discussion about you can't reform things. You either change or you will just have the same thing. So, and then in the end, you end up with this discussion. Only the revolution will be the actual change. Yeah. So there are no reforms. So reforms are not possible. That will be my question.
I propose a completely different reading of this sentence. First of all, reforms are changes. Okay, we need to realize that reforms are changes, revolutions are changes, reforms are changes. Change is change. Okay, so it's not either change through revolution or reforms which are not change. The idea that Marx gives here, to the best of my understanding, has nothing to do with revolution. It has everything to do with change. Okay, if you want a certain kind of psychology to develop, every kind of psychodynamics psychologist knows that. And other psychologists know it too. You want people to embrace a different psychology. You need to create a material change in their life. Okay, that's what I'm saying. Whether the change is via reforms, whether the change is radical or not, this is a different question. I do agree that revolutions offer radical changes, whereas reforms do not offer radical changes. Yes, but this has nothing to do with ideas. By the way, I can imagine a capitalist medicine that embraced a different ethic because the compromise had to be renegotiated. So, and now the change can be perhaps not radically meaningful, but it can be meaningful. How much meaningful? To the degree that the change in the capitalist medicine is meaningful. That's it. I've made this point before. Now, as to your question about historical materialism, you may be right. I apologize, I should have mentioned historical materialism. The excuse, not the reason. I didn't have any reason why I didn't. No, it was not deliberate. My failure to call it historical materialism. What is historical materialism, as far as I'm concerned? And I think that Marx would have agreed with me if he could. Is nothing but scientific method. Historical materialism is scientific method. Why should I call it historical materialism? That's it. Okay? Yeah. It sounds better scientific.
Scientific materialism.
Scientific method sells a lot better than Marxism, as you know, or historical materialism and so on. God forbid. Yeah, the scientific. Yeah, words are really important. They are really important. I've given today a lecture to third-year medical students yesterday on research ethics, I explained to them that in patient invitation letters to take part in research or patient information sheet, there is a lot of emphasis on wording by the sponsors of the research. So, for example, the enterprise, the thing, will be described as clinical trial, as medical study, medical research, but never as a medical experiment. Okay, because it's all kind of synonym, medical experiment, all the same, yes, but it sells differently. Okay, medical experiment is obviously risky. Okay, whereas if it's study, it's not as risky. Although, okay, so this is really important. So forget about Marxism, forget about historical materialism. Let's talk about scientific method. Yes, sir.
So a couple points. One is I wanted to thank you for the one of the clearest expositions I've heard about the what brings ethics into being. These three conditions is lots of interesting things, but that's golden. So I wanted to invite you to play for a second, if I can, with a kind of an example. And that is, if we take a look at right now the tension between population-based medicine and patient-centered care under the guise of evidence-based medicine, as this umbrella, this rhetoric. To me, this is a very good example, at least in my simple understanding of what you were talking about, of how you have this tension, you have the two things trying to coexist at the same time in a capitalist system, depending on who your patient is. As a doctor, is your patient the patient, or is the patient gold standard based on some aggregate population of work that you have done? So I don't know, I just wanted to kind of invite you to kind of play with that idea for a second.
And you would be ideally expecting me to do what? To do what?
Fit it into the three conditions that you were talking about of bringing an ethics into being. Because it seems to me that in medicine today, we have this tension, and yet you really have both. You have these two groups of people trying to coexist.
Which groups?
You've got population-based medicine and you've got patient-centered care.
It's not groups of people.
You're right. It's not groups of people.
It's ideologies.
It's ideologies, yes.
Okay.
But they're trying to fit the two of them together as if the tension is not there, and the ideology is to make it seem that both can coexist at the same time, as what you would say a compromise.
Yeah, I think that one of the necessary, or at least possible features of a compromise, of any compromise, that it doesn't need to be logical. There's nothing logical in a compromise. It is simply contingent upon, the actual conditions. So if the power balance, or the gap in power, and the nature of the power involved requires to entertain both ideas at the same time, then they will exist at the same time with seemingly in a illogical or contradictory way, but it doesn't need to be the opposite. I can give you, I think, a better example from the Declaration of Helsinki on research involving the ethical principles of the World Medical Association on research involving humans. One point number 8 in the declaration, says that the interest of the patient comes first. Okay? And point number 16 says that the importance of the research objective should be proportional or proportional to something like that, to the risk to the patient. Okay, so the importance of the research objective must outweigh the risk to the patient. So in principle, there is no risk that is too much. Okay, there is seemingly a contradiction here, but what I see is simply two groups of doctors sitting in the room where the negotiation took place. One of them really cared about patients. The other one did not care about patients, cared about, the agenda or sponsors or whoever of research, okay? They both agreed to about these 2 points. Okay, so one didn't like the other point, yeah, but they agreed to have both of them as this was the compromise in the room, okay? And the result is that point number 8 is essentially a dead letter. And patient here in the case that you mentioned, none of them is dead letter. You have both patient-centered kind of care, because the compromise allows for such a care in one way or another, whatever this care means. But it also requires, in different respects, also population care at the same time. I hope I've answered the question. Yes, Doreen.
Thank you very much, Miran. I have 2 questions. The first one is, you have been saying, playing around with this relationship of power between groups of interest or people of interest. And you have said that it's one of the basic of developing ethics in the form. I was just remembering that Foucault has said there is no relationship that is not a power relation.
I disagree.
Okay. Can you expand on this? And can you expand on this in relationship to when you say we need a humanitarian medicine, we need a change in the content, and how would this look like?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I disagree that on a statement that all human relations are power relations. I disagree. Many of them are, perhaps most of them are, but there is at least no logical necessity that they are relations of power. Second, I have no problem with relations of power in the abstract. I have a big problem with certain relations of power. It all depends whether I have the power or they have the power. This is it, and therefore I can envisage what I call a humanist medicine, which will either or together or both be a medicine with no conflicts. Okay, and therefore it will require no ethic. In certain areas, it will require no ethic because there are no conflicts. The ethic will simply evaporate. Okay, that's one point. However, in the other areas where there is ethic, the interest, the general interest, what I regard as the interest of people as human beings, what is called the general interest, will prevail over particularistic interests, such as the interest in making profit. I have no problem with relations of power of that kind. Okay? So it's not either relations of power or no relations of power. My problem with Foucault is completely different. My problem with Foucault is that he has never, ever, ever named the power. He has never given the power a name. And by refusing or not giving power a name, yes, he has played into the hands of power.
My second question is, you went through the slide 12 very, very fast. Could we just go back?
Yes.
I just wanted to see if I understood.
Slide 12. What is it?
Well, the number 12.
The point 12.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, number 12. The content determines not only the form, but also the way.
Yeah, but below you say how medicine determines its essence differs from how the environment, for example, determines its physical or biological.
I've given you a general theory of the development of ethics. It does not apply this theory to the development of biological mutations. All right? Yes, Elias.
Miran, I have a lot of questions. First of all, thank you very much, both for the Marxian approach to your topic and the Marxist theory that you developed. Now, my understanding is that you apply a very simple rule of the Marxist, let's say, methodology, that ideology ideas are the superstructure of what happens on the material real world. So this form and content, I understand
Yeah,
this.
remind me
In
to
a
say
very
something
simple-
about superstructure and structure.
Fine.
Okay.
Which means that you can test this theory either looking in the past or looking in the future. Which means what? That theoretically you would expect that medicine under a system of slavery will produce its own system of ethics,
Yes.
and a socialized medicine, not a socialist, or a socialized medicine, or even a socialist medicine, will produce its own system of ethics.
Yes.
Do you have it, can you give us a couple of examples about how this works, either looking in the past or looking in the future? Did socialist medicine, for example, or socialized medicine produce, and I distinguish because you might disagree with it.
I'm not an expert on if this is what you ask on medical ethics. I intend to study this area on medical ethics in socialist countries.
Mhm.
I'm not an expert, so I cannot comment on this, unfortunately. But I can tell you, for example, that the Hippocratic ethic, which is kind of the historical emblem of kind of medical morality, primum non nocere, first thing do no harm, although it's not part of the Hippocratic oath, yes, but that the Hippocratic ethic is the ethic of commercial relations, okay, of a commercial medicine. There's one statement, for example, in the Hippocratic corpus that says, do not speak about fees in advance, with the patient in advance, okay? Not in advance, meaning that before the Hippocratic ethic, it was all about, money. It started with money. In our medicine, by the way, it starts in Harley Street. It starts with money. How much will it cost me? This is the first question. Okay, this is the ethic of the market. In the Hippocratic medicine, it was okay, we can't speak about fees in advance. That's not okay, but we can speak about fees later on. Okay, there are many justifications for that, but no, I can't. This is we need to enter details to be able to answer this question. Any other point you would like to make?
Yes, the other point is, again, going back to the Marxian, so the one that refers directly to the writings of Marx. I understand that you say that ethics correctly are a reflection of the, let's say, dominant type of medicine, which is the capitalist medicine. So what Marx might, this is the question, does Marx discuss on what is the role of capitalist medicines or the role of medicine within capitalism?
I have no knowledge about it, but I can tell you what Marxists later on have done about the.
No, I was asking for the Marxian.
For Marx's perspective, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. What is clear to me, for what it's worth, is that medicine, until the second half of the 20th century, for capitalism, for capital, was predominantly an area of within the sphere of production, whereas today it is predominantly or increasingly so an area within the sphere of consumption. Okay, we don't need to take care of the labor, the workhorses today, because they can be bought cheaply from I don't know where, they can be outsourced. The horses. It's not really about health, but it's about selling something. Yes,
Thank you very much for your talk. And maybe I didn't follow you well, but I have this question about is there such a thing as medicine with no conflict at all? Because or is there any relationship between doctors and patients with no conflict at all? And I'm saying this because when you were talking about what's behind ethics, you were saying that there should be at least a narrow, or preferably a narrow gap.
Not preferably. It's not a judgment. I'm stating a condition. A condition. The power gap needs to be very narrow, not too narrow. Yes.
However, in the market economy, as this country or Mexico, whatever, I think there is a big gap between practitioners and patients, and I think market economy puts a very big gap in between these two parties and is not narrow at all.
What you regard as a wide gap of power is still very narrow. Sufficiently narrow, not too narrow obviously, sufficiently narrow to require a compromise. That's it. Okay? So I agree with you. It's not the gap, the power gap must not be measured in absolute terms. Like if it's 2 meters wide, then it's small, but 2 kilometers it's wide. No, it is apparently sufficiently narrow to require the parties, all the parties, to necessitate that they negotiate some kind of compromise. But make it a little bit bigger, yes, the power gap. Make it a little bit bigger, the compromise will be dissolved. Okay. Now to the question of conflicts of interest. I cannot conceive of a medicine with no conflicts of interest. Okay, I have fancied patients in the past which put me in a position of conflict of interest. Okay, I mean, I cannot think of a medicine where doctors have, no kind of conflicts of interest are probably inevitable in medicine. However, there are areas of conflicts which are products of specific historical circumstances, and such conflicts did not exist yesterday and will probably not exist tomorrow. And a corresponding ethic will either develop or disappear with them. That's all I have to say. I don't conceive of a totally ethicless medicine in the future. Okay? It all started with an ethicless medicine. That's why we had the Hippocratic medicine. It was totally ethicless, and then Hippocrates came up with a compromise because he was about to lose everything. That's what I refer to when I say the power gap is narrow, not too narrow. Yes?
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting. What I'm thinking is that since everything is put in this capitalist society, in this context, without the relationship between the doctor and the patient, but at the same time both of them are related to other parties with greater power, both of them, and the compromises they make with them, not with each other, may also affect the emergence of the ethic. And we should somehow integrate this in our analysis. And I wonder how we could do that.
Well, I thank you for the comment. If I gave you an impression that the current compromise is between doctors and patients, then it was a wrong impression. Okay? I think that the patients and the doctors are, in some sense, both of them are victims, yes, of a compromise within with a third party, which is capital. Do I need to be explicit at this stage? Yes.
I'm just thinking a bit about the slide here and the way you kind of talked about medicine and the nature of medicine determining the ethics. And it's been a long time since I've read Marx or neo-Marxists, but that seems to be kind of one particular interpretation of Marx, right? If we think of like later debates between neo-Marxists about the relationship between capital and the state, for example, if we're thinking of Valancis and Ralph Miliband, there's some discussion of whether there can be some relative autonomy of the state, or even if we think of someone like Althusser and his discussion of the relationship between the Unterbau and the Überbau. And there's some idea that there could be some reciprocal relationship. And I was just wondering, in your, I haven't thought about it enough, but it seems to me that it might be possible that that ethics could change medicine, that there could be some kind of power outside of medicine that could impact on the way that medicine is practiced. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were. And maybe you've been through it already, but I was kind of it was a lot to take in.
Yeah. Well, when I gave here the outline of the relationship between form and content, I said pretty much everything I have to say about it. I can easily entertain the argument about the relative autonomy of the form. Okay? And indeed, it works very well with my claim that the form may lag behind a change in the content and may not fit it as well as it used to fit it, and still, but that does not mean that it is really autonomous. It means only that the relations of power within the content are such that the form still sticks to it. But in a second, these relations will change, the form no longer sticks to it. That's one point. Second point is that I do recognize that when something that, a potential form, something that is totally abstract, such as an ethic that I propose, it's not a collective ethic, it's not a social ethic, I simply propose an ethic, okay? That once it is embraced by the collective, we have a new object. The form and the content, they constitute an object. Then and there, the ethic with the content, the form with the content certainly creates something new, okay? This is the maximum that I would give to the so-called dialectical relationship between form and content. This is the maximum. But the idea that our medicine could embrace an ethic which is opposed to the power that dominates our medicine is, as far as I'm concerned, a total absurd. Okay? Enough? Here we have another one.
No, I'll wait.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miran. Thank you. Well done. So,